Hello, BookTube. I haven't done a tag in a while. I have a tag for you today, and it's one that I'm woefully late on. It's an absolute classic from an absolute classic series, and it's been hanging out there. I was tagged who knows how long ago, months ago, and I haven't got to it, but I'm finally doing it now. It's one of the foodie book tags from Literary Gladiators, from Josh at Literary Gladiators. This is Josh's nut book tag. This current iteration of the foodie book tag is about nuts. I've done quite a few of these. I love them, absolutely love them. I'll leave a link to his original video down below so that you can feast on all its nutty goodness. But all the prompts are nut related. So the first one is Almond, a work that can be equally a staple in a classroom setting and for personal, casual reading. And I know this is going to sound very trite, but nevertheless, I chose Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, which I don't think I have ever known a case where that book failed. Whether it was a casual recommendation to a casual reader on their own personal time, or whether it was to a classroom. And no matter what that classroom was, no matter how great or lack thereof their level of reading was, no matter how enthused they were, it works on readers. So that's going to be my answer to number one. Number two is Walnut, a 21st century translated work you feel should be studied. I'm not always 100% sure what Josh's prompts have to do with the nut in question. I don't know anything 21st century about walnuts, but for me, a translated work that you feel should be studied, I'm going to go with something that I've shown on this channel before, which is The Catholic School by Edoardo Abinati, which was translated from the Italian by Anthony Sugar. It's a huge thing. It's 1,000 pages long. I thought it was incredibly good, incredibly gripping, disturbing, unsettling, and very and controlled. Ordinarily, with a book that's 1,000+ pages long, I just steel myself for long passages that could have gone by the board, and I didn't detect many in this book, hardly a handful. So I'm hoping that it will be studied in 21st century literature classes. I'm hoping that it will be. Then the third one is Peanut, a media-based adaptation you credit for getting people to read. And I'm going to say, most of you already know my stance when it comes to media adaptations of works of literature. They're almost always better than the work of literature that they adapt. And the tiny handful of cases where that's not true share something in common with all the ones where it is true, which is that I believe almost any big screen literary adaptation, or small screen literary adaptation, I like to think about it, the small screen is doing some fantastic literary adaptation work. I believe almost any one of those adaptations will get people to read. If they fall in love with the movie, then they're going to want to find the source material, as we call it in the 21st century. They're going to want to find the source material and see if there's more magic there. When you come out of a movie and you're passionately in love with it, you want more. So I would think that any literary adaptation, including the bad ones, but especially the good ones, the recent adaptation of Little Women, for instance, I would hope drove a lot of people to seek out the novel, maybe, and give it a try. And the example that came to mind for the tag was Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. Now, the publisher certainly was counting on that, because they brought out every kind of companion in the world. They slapped movie stills on the books in 3 volumes, in 1 volume, with elaborate decorations, you name it, and they did it. The publishing arm of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings was not asleep at the wheel. They were clearly counting on a direct connection between the magic of the movies and the magic of the book. But even if they hadn't been doing that, I'd be willing to bet that a lot of people, I know that it was true, for instance, for the Rankin and Bass cartoon of The Hobbit back in the 70s, that Rankin and Bass cartoon drove up sales of The Hobbit quite a bit. It drove a lot of people to find that book because they'd seen it. All of a sudden they'd seen it and they wanted more texture. And that's what you get with Lord of the Rings. You watch Peter Jackson's movies, they are fantastic adaptations, but even watching the movies with the most sympathy in the world, which I did, I went into the first one a little skeptical, and it took me maybe the first 5 minutes, the magnificent first 5 minutes of the first movie, to be sold completely, to be won over completely. But even though I was sympathetic as a viewer, I was still thinking, boy, oh boy, this is going to make anybody think, I want more of this. And you get a lot more in the books. So the Lord of the Rings will stand for my answer here. Then prompt number 4 is Cashew, a good writer with an aggressively straightforward tone. I like that. I like aggressively straightforward. And I think I'm going to nominate here William Vollmann. the author of recently a great big novel, but also relatively recently a 2-volume work, The Carbon Ideologies, that was aggressively straightforward is a very good way to put it. It was poetic in times, it was elegiac all throughout, but it was aggressively straightforward. Yes, he's an author who, despite the fact that he writes, or maybe because he writes so much, he doesn't usually gild the lily all that much. He doesn't go in for filigree. His tone tends to be straightforward. Really good for all that. And when he has poetic characters, he's willing to put poetry in their mouths, definitely, and capable of it. Prompt number 5 is Hazelnut, a sweet work with rich description. I'm going to go with an older one here, and one that it doesn't often get mentioned on BookTube, but A Fine and Private Place by Peter S. Beagle, the author of The Last Unicorn. This is A Fine and Private Place is a far more meditative book, far less in the way of Tolkien-esque high fantasy. Takes place in and around a mausoleum in a graveyard, and the 2 of the main characters are ghosts. It's a quieter work, but beautiful, just and ultimately sweet, ultimately heartwarming. I don't think Beagle would have liked the word sweet, but I know what you mean. I know what it connotes, and I think A Fine and Private Place comes closer to it than anything else that he wrote. Prompt number 6 is Pistachio, an accessible biblical reference or story in a given work. Now, I'm not 100% sure if Josh is asking here for the work itself or for the story itself. But the story that I have in mind is the story of Noah's Ark. A good and righteous man who is warned that the world is going to end and has a duty to preserve as much of it, of 2 of every animal, 7 of every animal, however, whichever account you want to use, he and his family. He has a duty to do that and is mocked by his neighbors for building a boat inland. He knows what's coming and they don't. So in addition to having put up with their evil and their debased ways for the whole of his life, he also has to put up with their mockery at the end. And it turns out that he and his family and all the animals on board survive. So it's not only an apocalypse is coming story, it's also a post-apocalypse story. And that's really neat and resonates. And I think you can tell the way it resonates by the fact that it has been adapted and twisted and transmogrified a million times, not only in science fiction, but in fiction as well, just endlessly. I'm thinking of there's one particular novel, Not Wanted on the Voyage, that's pretty darn great, but there are plenty of others. Noah's Wife is another great example. So I'm going to use the story of Noah's Ark as an answer here, although I want to stress, before we move on, I won't harp on it, I'll be very quick. I want to stress, if it needs stressing, I know for a fact that in the broader world, in the world outside of BookTube, it does need stressing periodically. I want to stress that it's a myth. Okay? Nothing like it ever happened. Noah's flood did not happen. It is not real. If I had a dime for every commissioning editor who read a line of mine in a review in which I just offhandedly mentioned this is a myth, of course, nothing like it ever happened. If I had a dime for every editor in New York and Chicago and Cincinnati, well-educated people who've written back and said, what do you mean by that line? What do you mean Noah's flood never happened? If I had a dime for every one of those. No. So I want to stress here before we move on, I'm talking about the myth of Noah's Ark, the myth of the Noachian flood. I am not talking about the reality of the Noachian flood, because it didn't happen. Okay? All right, good. Prompt number 7 is Pecan, a work that gives you a sense of the American South. And here I want to mention Tom Franklin. I'm thinking specifically of Crooked Letter, his a relatively recent novel about rural Mississippi, but really anything that he wrote. He's a terrific Southern writer in a minor key, a terrific B-level Southern writer. Crooked Letter is my recommendation or my mention for this prompt, but really just the author in general. I don't think he'll let you down. Let's see here. Prompt number 8 is Brazil Nut, a work that brings about a controversy within a country. A little bit vague on the prompt. I'm going to mention here Fire and Fury by Michael Wolff from a couple of years ago, which was one of the first big Trump White House exposés and the first one to be a multi-platinum New York Times bestseller. There have been a few others since then, but this one created that mold. And it was insider information because Michael Wolff was invited by the Trump campaign to follow it throughout the end of its run, through its victory, and then through its early days in the White House. And so you had these meetings, scandalous meetings, where blatantly illegal stuff was discussed just openly, and he was there, eagerly writing it all down. So one commentator put it that if you're in a room and you're discussing things, and Michael Wolff is at the end of the couch and he's bouncing up and down, he's so happy, you've got a real problem. And he eventually wrote a book that describes basically a mafia operation, and a deranged one, a mafia operation that's one gust of wind away from going completely off the rails. Something that an entire presidential administration being run the way the old Trump business was run, with everything being run through someone who has the mentality of a 5-year-old, and nothing being possible without that. It's a mafia control, so nothing is done without you running it by Tony Soprano, because if you don't, and it works well, he's going to take the credit and whack you. And if it goes poorly, then he's going to shoulder all the credit on you and whack you. There's no good outcome. So everything has to be run through the boss, the head boss, the godfather. And you can't run an administration that way, especially if the godfather in question, unlike Tony Soprano, for instance, and we're going to use him as an example, doesn't understand anything. Nothing at all. Doesn't understand anything at all. So the old Trump businesses, headquartered in New York, ran every decision. Every decision had to be run through Donald Trump to get his yes or no, all done on his infamous gut. And that is how you go bankrupt 8 times. That's how you can run an Atlantic City casino into bankruptcy. I couldn't do that, but this guy did. And that is why you have... That is why you get the Trump administration that is described in Fire and Fury. It's a fascinating book. It's not Tolstoy by any measure, but what was the prompt? It brought about a controversy because you had excerpts from it that it hastened and worsened the corrosive paranoia of the Trump administration. Everybody's out to get us attitude that they have, the circling the wagons, history will vindicate us, I'll be down in the bunker type attitude that they have now. And there were critics, even in my own profession, who criticized Michael Wolff for accelerating that process. And the obvious response, I wouldn't trust him to make it, but the obvious response is, if you're not a deranged mafia operation, then you won't be characterized that way. Anyway, next prompt is Pine Nut. We're at number 9. Pine Nut is a small but important work. I went a little predictable here and chose 1911's Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton. Not at all one of my favorite things of hers to read, but it's been taught because it's 100 pages long. It's been taught in schools for a century now, and that makes it influential. That means that people who will avocado munching blue-haired hipsters who will avoid Edith Wharton for the rest of their life on principle, and because they're morons, are forced to read at least a bit of her prose. So I would call that influential, important. Prompt number 10 is Macadamia, a dense, wordy, and sometimes difficult work which may also be rewarding. And I'm going to use an example. You think dense and difficult, you think of Thomas Pynchon, and I'm going to use him as my author, and I'm going to use Against the Day, which is... it's a very, very strange novel. I think the last great performance from Pynchon that we'll ever get. Certainly the last greatly Pynchonian performance, where no one else could have written it, and where something like his artistic vision is definitely at work running throughout the thing. I have been grappling with that book since it came out. I understood probably 10% of what I read the first time I read it. And then the second time I read it, I think I read a little more. I think I got a little more of it than that, but still no higher than 25%. I would hope someday to get to 50 or 60% of what I think I understand about that book. But I think it counts as a wordy and sometimes difficult, dense work. Then prompt number 11 is Chestnut, and that is a perfect winter read. Naturally, I thought of The Lion in Winter by James Goldwyn. Well, what shall we hang? The holly or each other? It does take place over Christmas. It does take place. I mean, it's a horrific family drama, a horrifically corrosive family drama, but it is often referred to as having taken place over Christmas. uh, and then prompt number 12 is Acorn. What kind of works do you find yourself hoarding or binge reading as of late? And I'm not doing any hoarding because I'm not acquiring any books, but binge reading, very much so. Yes, I have noticed in the last month I have been binge reading comfort food. I've been delving deep into Tolkien, deep into Aubrey and Matron, the Patrick O'Brian Aubrey and Matron novels, deep into Regency romances, these old style Regency romances. What have we got here? The Calico Countess. That even takes place in winter. I've been delving deep into those to distract myself. Sure thing, surefire distractions. And then prompt number 13 is, what is your favorite kind of nut? My favorite kind of nut is a salted almond. Prompt number 14 is peanut gallery. Who do you tag? And ordinarily here's where I would have appended a good dozen people that I want to tag. But I've noticed something on BookTube recently. No doubt in response to this worldwide pandemic that we're all going through. We're all going through the same thing at the same time. That a lot of people just don't feel up to tags. They just don't feel like doing it. And I don't want to impose by. I understand that and I respect it, and I don't want to impose on that if you're one of the ones feeling it. So I'm going to use the old BookTube formula here, the old standard, and I'm going to say that if you want to do this tag, if you haven't done one of Josh's great foodie tags, but if this latest one, the nut book tag, if you haven't done it and you feel like doing a tag, I would love to hear your answers. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.